Do you have a story or two about your time at Fourth that you'd like to share?
Thought about this a little bit, and ones I wanted to tell was the church's relationship with Congregation Sinai. Is just a very meaningful and wonderful story. And it begins when the rabbi for Congregation Sinai, which was a big synagogue on the south side in Hyde Park, and Howard Berman was his name, and Howard called me. I didn't know him yet, and he said, introduced himself and explained that he had a lot of their members who were living in our neighborhood and were not comfortable driving down to Hyde Park every Friday night for Sabbath, for a synagogue. And Howard got the idea, do you have any space that we might have our Sabbath services in your building on a Friday night? Well, Fourth Church, nothing like that had ever happened. And so I brought it to the session, and the session talked a long time about this. It's hard to imagine this now, but at the time it seemed like a pretty radical thing to do. And can Jewish people actually worship in our sanctuary? Is that okay? Finally, it got done. The session approved it, and so they started having it, and it was a popular thing. And our Jewish neighbors came, and it was in what is today Anderson Hall. Used to be Blair Chapel. That's where the Sabbath services took place. So after a year or so, Howard called me again. I'd talked to him many times. They were very grateful. And Howard said, it's this is going so well. Do you think maybe we could have a meal, have some food? And so, of course, so that added to it. And then finally, I got another call, and he said, most of our members are now in your neighborhood, and so we're going to come and we're going to build a synagogue in your neighborhood. And it's customary in the Jewish tradition, you build your building to house the maximum number of people for high holy days.
Right. And
that's when everybody comes. And the economic realities were you simply couldn't build a building that big in our neighborhood. There's not enough real estate available, and it was too expensive. So this is a really radical idea. If we came to your neighborhood and built a synagogue, could we have our high holy day services in your big sanctuary? Well, gulp, that was really a stretch. And once again, the session talked about it. Is this an appropriate use? Is this a faithful use of our resources and our sanctuary? And we finally concluded that yes, it was. And so we happily said, yes, it's a wonderful idea. So that's still going on. And I think that's one of the great events in the life of Fourth Presbyterian Church, pre-COVID and post-COVID, when high holy days roll around in the fall and our Jewish neighbors find a home in our sanctuary. And subsequent rabbis and I collaborated on a lot of things after that. That opened the door to all sorts of joint education projects and service projects. And the rabbi used to laugh. He said, our Jewish people now have favorite pews, just like you do. So they get a little miffed if somebody's sitting in their Presbyterian pew for high holy day. So that's one story. I've got a funny story about the manse. I've always loved to cook. Weber grill, I love to grill. And so I was determined I was going to do that when I moved into the manse. Well, there's a little difficulty with logistics. And if you walk down Chestnut Avenue, there's a little alcove and stairways that lead into the basement of the manse. And it's all concrete and brick around it. So I thought that's a perfect place for my Weber grill. So I did that for a couple of times. And one night, back in the day when you had squirted all that fluid on it and a big fire. So I did that, came back up into the house to wait for the fire to mature. And Sue was standing at the sink and she said, honey, I hate to tell you, but there's a fire truck on Chestnut. And I went down, and here were two fire trucks and a crew of people, and they were not amused. I offered them hamburgers. somebody, of course, saw it and just assumed the church was on fire. And so it was a 5-alarm fire. Anyhow, that ended that. So I moved my Weber grill out to the Garth, and I had to carry it out and cook, and always, every time a crowd gathered and people joked and laughed, and it was fun for a while. And I finally gave that up. Another man's story. Ryan was in high school, and Sue and I forget what the event was, but it was a really dressy. I had a tuxedo on, and we left Brian home alone, and we came back to the manse several hours later, and the front door was wide open.
Yikes.
And I thought, oh, this is not good. We assumed that somebody had broken in, and so I called police. I called 911, and the police came, and a couple officers came, and they agreed this looked an awful lot like a break-in. And he said, "Now, sir, I want you to come with me, and I want you to point out where anything is that might be of value." And I said, "Well, there's not much, but of course I'll do that." So this policeman drew his service revolver and flashlight, and he said, stay behind me. And I guided him up the stairs, through the whole house, every room. And finally we're convinced nothing was amiss. So I later put together the story. Brian, as soon as we left, invited half a dozen of his friends in, and they had gone somewhere, and the last guy out forgot to pull the door shut. So for a couple hours, the man's door was wide open. Nothing untoward happened, but we got a lot of laughs out of that.
So how did the church's mission to help people locally and globally change during your tenure?
Well, as I mentioned earlier, the church had written this mission statement. You do that when you're between ministers. You kind of examine the whole operation and you try to envision the future. And the church really had an appetite to expand its presence in the city and the neighborhood. That all started before I was here. Elam Davies guided the church through the 60s, which were tumultuous, and many big churches like Fourth Church were casualties of that time. People stopped going to downtown churches. A lot of downtown churches just decided to move to the suburbs, or lock their doors and put a chain link fence around the outside to protect the windows and all that sort of thing. Well, Elam was so smart, he did the exact opposite. He opened the doors and the windows and invited the neighbors in. And the result was a tutoring program, volunteers only, 50, 75 kids, the social service center, the counseling center. It was a time of vast change for Fourth Church, and the personality of the church began to really evolve during Elam's tenure. Well, by the time I was privileged to be here, the church was really ready to get up and run. And I found that very, very exciting. One of the first things we did was designate an associate pastor position as associate pastor for mission. And Ted Miller was the first person to occupy that position. And as soon as Ted arrived, good things started to happen. The tutoring program obviously could grow. And so we hired former Chicago public school teacher T. Akbar to direct that program, and by golly, it grew from 75 kids with all volunteers to 450, 500 kids. We added a hot meal to the program when we realized some of our kids, mostly from Cabrini Green at that time, were hungry, and we found restaurants in the area quite willing to donate food. And one of the interesting things that happened, I love this story, the attendance at tutoring precipitously dropped without any warning, and we couldn't figure out what the problem was. And there's a lot of white guilt about programs like that, and there's always been a sense in which maybe we should not be inviting people into our fancy Gothic building. We ought to be going out. So we gathered some mothers In fact, Sue had organized a little group of mothers who were waiting for their kids. They came to the manse for coffee. I mean, we talked to them. We said, "What in the world is going on? And should we come to you?" And the first thing he said was, "No, please don't. We want to come here. You're the only place in Michigan Avenue that our children are welcome." And we never thought about that. And they went on and told us about kids who were 10, 11, 12 years old, had never, ever seen Lake Michigan.
Oh,
And
wow.
didn't feel secure. So, but they felt secure coming to Fourth Church. So the mother said, "Please don't." And why did drop in attendance? And that was at the height of the gangs and gang violence and drugs around Cabrini. And they explained to us that kids who used to walk had to cross 2 gang boundaries. And if you had your ball cap on the wrong way, that could get you, it could get you shot, could get you in trouble. So we had a problem. We said, "Well, should we come and pick you up on buses?" And they loved that idea. So we had to raise the money to hire buses, and then that program is still going on. So the buses went over to Cabrini. We had someone on the buses at all times to monitor and take care of it. Anyhow, that kind of rescued the tutoring program, and right away it returned to its numbers. We made a delightful discovery that tutoring became our most effective evangelism. Church growth was not totally, but in large measure powered by tutors who would be hanging around the church. They're young professionals, medical students, young doctors, lawyers, and they would somehow connect this kid that they had now fallen in love with the church, and somehow made that connection between reaching out in love to a neighbor with the Christian faith, which most of them had kind of dropped years before. And that was one of the privileges and honors of my ministry on New Member Sunday, to see this lineup of these wonderful young adults who came through the tutoring program and decided that Christianity was worth another look, and devoted themselves to the church. So Teddy even had us one time. We rented an apartment or two at Cabrini, and we called it the Center for Whole Life. And we hired a director for that. And so we opened our door, and the only purpose was to be a little haven for residents, mostly mothers with children, stop by. We had a bunch of toys for the kids, and the coffee pot was always on. And I don't know how long that lasted. It lasted till, I guess, Cabrini came down, but for a while we were doing that. So that's pretty much the story of Mission, and it's an exciting story.